We're going to have a little break in the music, and Dr. Huguenin is going to speak about the interesting aspect of Brahms music. Brahms was very much involved with folk music, studied German folk music, Hungarian folk music, and used it in his music. And many other composers did also. So we asked Sandy to speak about folk music, the romantic relativism with folk music. That's what he's going to talk about.
Thank you, Yuval. It's been part of our tradition as part of the series that we always try to take some time and put the work and the cultural milieu of our composers into some sort of historical context. And what I want to talk about today was a question I've always wondered a little bit about, is why is it when you look at late 19th century, any 19th century culture, you can't go very far without running into examples of the themes related to folk culture. Particularly what I'm talking about is that when you look at the poetry of Robert Burns or William Wordsworth, you find the rustic herdsmen and peasant girls. When you look at music, people like Liszt and Chopin, Brahms incorporating peasant folk melodies into their music. Look at the 19th century, Hans Christian Andersen, the Brothers Grimm, going and replaying and writing down, turning into literature, ancient folk stories, which really, even by their time, were thought of often as children's stories. You don't have to look far in romantic art before you find hermits and peasants watching their herds. And it's that seems sort of funny to me because, I mean, I look at us and we have our rural poor, our rural agrarians, just like they did. But it's sort of funny, we look at the 19th century and these people, these painters and poets and composers, who were generally well-educated urbanites, really were quick to lionize and see as idealized and heroic their rural laborers. I think to try to put that in context, one thing that's important to look at is what's happening in the 19th century. Not a good example of romantic painting, but I chose it because it's sort of bleak and sort of urban. Gave me a certain thoughts about the 19th century. It's funny because I'm a political historian, and when I look at the 19th century, I tend to see it in very sort of macro level. And I look at it and I see that in the course of the 19th century, Europeans basically banished famine. The last major famine in Western Europe is 1848, 1849, so the locomotive means that we don't worry that there's no food in the shelves at Safeway because there's a bad harvest locally. They discover the germ theory of disease, and really they don't banish epidemic disease, but the great cholera epidemics, all the bubonic plague, the great epidemic diseases that have been so common for years really just ceased to occur with any frequency by the late 19th century due to sewers, due to sanitizing during surgery. They understood something about how disease spread. It's even a period of relative peace. There's really not a major European war between 1815 and 1914. So you look how long people are living, how much the population is increasing. Look at their wealth, just how much is being produced. And people in 1800 had, most people had one set of clothes and they made it. Come back, 1900, they've got underwear, new invention. And they also have so much clothing that you can order it through the mail, and they have clothing sizes. Rather than having your clothes, the textiles have been so valuable, everything was made to order, basically. You made it yourself. Now, they'll go mass-produce things. You can order through the Sears catalog by 1900, in America at least. So it looks like a period of wonderful progress. And you sort of think, how could anyone be anything less than enamored with this? But it's also a period of really dramatic change. I mean, maybe the period of the greatest change, or the most accelerated change in human history. So if you look at Europe in 1800, most Europeans lived in the countryside and they were farmers. 1900, most of them live in the city and they're involved in some aspect of industry, usually as workers. So this is an incredibly dramatic change. When you look at industrialization, urbanization, I think there's a certain ambivalence to what's going on. And so we see a very different sort of response to this. I think most historians are quick to look at Romanticism as a response to some of the things that are happening in Europe. People living in crowded cities, people being pulled away from their families and the cultures that had surrounded them for centuries. And so what we see is a response in Romanticism where the Enlightenment and probably the mainstream of European thought is rationalistic. We've got a movement that values passion and emotion. Where progress is really the order of the day, we've got intellectuals, artists who question that progress is always good. I think one important difference you see is attitudes towards nature. And the 19th century really is an era that tries to understand and control nature. You can see that everywhere. For many romantic figures, nature is something which is to be celebrated. It's something sublime and powerful. I like this painting because it actually makes a point. You can't see the point, but the point is the Alps. Keller loves to paint the Alps. And the Alps, in European history, for centuries, had been a giant obstacle. It was terrible. You couldn't get anywhere. You tried to go from Southern Europe to Northern Europe. Alps from the way, 4 passes, every intersection. The Swiss have toll booths and banks. It's terrible. It's in your way. Suddenly, with Romanticism, the 19th century invents tourism. What had been an obstacle becomes something sublime and beautiful, something that you can gain spiritually just by visiting. And it's not the only place. The Pyrenees, the Hebrides, places that have been sort of geographical just oddities, become places that people go out of their way to visit. I think we have the tendency to think of, when we look at the Enlightenment, look at the 18th century, we can see all sort of heavyweight philosophers we associate with the Enlightenment, people like Hume or Locke. Then we look at the Romantic period, and it's a cultural movement. So many of the main figures, they're poets and they're composers, and I think we sometimes tend to certainly, for many years, I often had the thought that, the world of ideas is not as connected here. But that's absolutely not the case. And you can go and find many places where Hegel, Kant, Burke all affect the Romantic movement. There's no philosopher that affects them more than Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau, 18th century French thinker, a contemporary of the Enlightenment thinkers, people like Voltaire, who we didn't get along with. And so we often tend to think of him as, one of these Enlightenment guys that's hanging out in the French salons in the 1760s and 70s. But in his ideas, Jean-Jacques Rousseau said some things that were very non-Enlightenment, some things that were very different and have a profound effect on culture in the 19th century. The most important thing that Rousseau says is Rousseau does not take for granted, he's skeptical about the power of human reason. Right? For so much of the late 18th and 19th century, everybody thinks reason is something that can understand any aspect of human existence, it can change anything. And here's Rousseau, he says, reason actually is a recent development. It's something that man and society has created. What is original, what's lasting, what's best is nature. Nature is best. Reflection is actually inferior to intuition. What we've learned is inferior to what we've inherited. And so Rousseau sees nature as the original state and the best state, and most of the things that are wrong with our world have come from society. And the implication, of course, is that we are at our best when we're our most natural. And this comes over into the Romantics' ideas about nature, that nature is generally positive. I think here you can see, it's certainly, here I get a picture, this is Gifts of the Sea. I grew up next to the sea, I grew up in Cape Cod. Twice a day at low tide I saw the Gifts of the Sea, they don't quite look like this. But the picture of the Romantics very often has nature is very positive. Nature is positive, it is dignified, it's benevolent, I think you're going to be a little bit exotic. It's also sublime. Nature can affect people for many romantic poets and novelists. They see nature being able to affect people in ways that are not really rational. You can't really define it mathematically. An example I would think of is something like, if you read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, right? You've got the monsters pursuing Victor Frankenstein. Life is terrible, but when he goes out on Lake Geneva or he goes up in the mountains, he can be transported, he can escape it all. Or William Wordsworth's poetry, really sees a goal from nature that's beyond anything you can objectify.